Thank you, everyone who's joined in. Very excited about the webinar today. My name's Richie. I'm one of the founders at PriceLabs. I have Francois here, who's the co-founder and CEO at Enso Connect. We're going to talk about your growth drivers and revenue strategies in the second half of 2025, or the last 4 months of 2025, really, here. We're going to look at data of how things have evolved over the last couple of months, what we are seeing, but also touch base on looking at untapped demand in STR market. How do you adapt to traveler expectations and their booking habits? And then how can you learn from the demand shifts that we have seen so far in 2025? This would start with a data-heavy session, and then we'll get into the tactics of how you can apply certain things. And with that, I'm excited to welcome Francois. Introduce yourself quickly.
My name is Francois. I'm the co-founder of Enso. We are a guest experience platform for the vacation rental industry, servicing over 50,000 listings, 30 plus integrations. And really what we focus on is driving more revenue with upsells and automating more conversations with AI. So our three products include a branded guest app, the Boarding Pass. We've almost trademarked this name. We keep using the name of the Boarding Pass if you've heard of it. Our unified messaging platform with some upcoming releases on AI for reasoning models that can help effectively automate more conversations. But thanks for having me, Richie. Really appreciate it.
Very cool. And quickly about PriceLabs, we are a pricing and revenue management software. We work across asset classes. Vacation rentals and short-term rentals is where we started because I was putting my house on Airbnb almost 11 years ago now, and realized that I was pricing it at flat $100 a night, and everyone around me was pricing at $100 a night all through the year. And I was living in Chicago. It didn't make sense. That's when we realized that we should probably be adjusting these prices. Today, we primarily work with vacation rentals and short-term rentals, but also work with mid-term rentals, 28-day plus stays, or if you have a serviced apartment or apart hotel, glamping sites, campgrounds, etc., hotels, hostels, etc. We price a little over 500,000 properties, work in several languages, 6 here, 7th one coming soon. And then our teams all remote, distributed around the world. We have several types of products. Dynamic pricing, which is our core product, adjusting rates based on supply and demand every day. Portfolio analytics, which is a free-to-use software, allows you to access your own data, but make sense of that data through a very intelligent analytical software. Market dashboards help you understand what's happening in certain markets, whether that's your city, your neighborhood, your country, or anywhere around the world. And then Revenue Estimator helps you if you have an address and certain property type, amenities, or metadata, etc. You can plug that into Revenue Estimator to get a sense of how much money can you make from an address on Airbnb. Over to you, Francois.
Agenda for today, we're going to talk about some of the macro snapshots, so supply, demand, occupancy. Obviously, PriceLabs has quite a bit of data for this. We're going to support this with a lot of data-heavy slides. We're going to talk about some of the expectations and behaviors of travelers. These are changing and changing quickly, especially as we look at how people are searching for their vacation rentals. Demand is not gone. It is concentrated. We're going to touch up a bit on demand. A few playbook items around what the top operators are doing, and then what's the focus and some of the next steps for 2025. We'll start off with the short-term rental market for 2025, from boom to maturity.
I see we have people from various countries joining in today. For context, today we are specifically going to talk about US market and the trends that we're seeing in US market, but this is applicable to most other markets. And as we go through, I can probably also point to places on PriceLabs where you can find this data in case you're joining from other geos outside of US. High level, just to give you a quick understanding, today we see roughly 1.57 million active listings or properties in US on Airbnb, which is up from 2024, about 4.5%. And then occupancy has remained similar as last year and actually last couple of years. But we are seeing that when we last pulled this data, in August and September, we were seeing it was pacing a little behind compared to 2024. And then lastly, even though occupancy has held steady, rates though have remained fairly strong. On average, we see $249 in average daily rate, which is up from last year, even though the occupancy is down. What we're seeing is a normalization, or what I call consolidation era. we saw very quick growth over 2021, 2, 3, just coming out of COVID. And then more recently, we have seen more stable paced growth in terms of supply. We're going to talk about how opportunity may depend on you getting things right and not just the market momentum that existed in, say, 21 or 22. If you'd see in 21, 22, 23, we had this rapid growth in supply, almost 20 plus percent points of supply growth in those 3 years. And then we entered the normalization era in 2024 and where we stand today in 2025, of course, driven by economy, driven by traveler demand, driven by the interest rates. There are so many various factors, but where we are seeing is that we're right now getting into a space where the overall supply is consolidating and it's growing at a slower pace. Along with that growth of slower pace, what we're seeing is that the demand, though, has held fairly well. It's not, even though the supply has grown, the demand has held equally well. Book nights are up year over year. By book nights, we mean the number of nights booked in that month. So even though you may have 1.6 million properties, and of that 1.6 million properties in a given month, let's say there are 30 nights, we come up with an estimation of how many nights are actually getting booked. 2023 to 2024 is in gray, and then 24 to 25 is in red. So August of 2024 was much better than August of 2023. But over time, there's just a slight growth relatively. So in 2025, we're seeing some growth, but not as much growth in booking volume overall. As a result of supply increasing, but booking growth being reasonable, what you're seeing is that the occupancy is normalizing. And we've seen close to that 62 to 64 bracket over the last couple of years. In 22, even though the demand was higher, we just saw this, the supply of listings come up fast. And so you had more bookings per listing. And in 2025, that started to normalize. And you're starting to see us operate in that 62 to 64 band quickly. And then if we go to rates, though, rates continue to go up year on year. The rates have not normalized. Every year, we are seeing somewhere between 3 to 4% growth, except for 2023. I think that was the shock year coming right out of COVID, supply still being high, people trying to drop prices in order to capture demand, right? But then realizing that there is only so much demand in the market, you can't create organic demand by having slightly lower prices. And so I think the overall market has gone to just a steady state growth in ADR. And overall, our understanding of this market is that we're today operating in a stable, mature market where supply growth has normalized, demand is becoming steadier and steadier. And so as operators, as property managers, you have to figure out how do you take some levers that you have to drive revenue, whether that's your rate strategy, or how do you want to pace when you get a booking, or your guest experience approach. So you want to figure that out because the tailwinds that existed in, say, 21, 22, we're really starting to see that stabilization, that consolidation come up. And as a result of that, in order to win in this market, you really have to focus on your pricing strategy, your guest experience. When are you going to get that demand, and what kind of demand? And so we're going to touch on all of these in a bit. Francois, anything from your end, or how are you thinking about this?
100%. I think, and we're going to touch up on how guest behaviors are changing, but when it comes to even just the way people are searching for their holiday listings and so on, things are changing. So if you have a bit more supply, that normalizing occupancy at that 62%, like you mentioned, things are going to get a bit tighter. And with search and how people are finding your listings changing, I think we're going to have a bit more of a bearish outlook to a certain extent for some of the property managers out there. That being said, the ones who are remaining professional, who are driving a solid guest experience, trying to get those referrals, are somewhat winning. The demand isn't gone. It's just effectively concentrated. And I think we're going to touch up on some of those markets that are winning versus those that are a bit more pacing.
Completely makes sense. To Francois's point, it's not that all the demand has gone. It's just, it's in some cases, it's appearing in pockets. For example, if we look at a graph here, which is Labor Day weekend, in 18 out of 24 key markets that we track, we are seeing that more nights are getting booked this year compared to last year. Branson is up by 40% compared to last year, right? Or Destin is up by 30%. So a lot more people on Labor Day are traveling this year compared to last year. And they may be shifting focus from one region to another region, possibly. But we're seeing, it's not just that occupancy has gone down or has stabilized, right? It may be moving around in pockets. And that's where the core theme of this webinar comes at, which is how can, like, thinking about it, not just in broad terms, but also in terms of pockets and getting better at it. The core message, demand isn't gone. I think it's has stabilized, but at the same time, it's concentrated in some places versus others. You want to think about capturing concentrated demand, event-driven spikes in your markets, and shorter meaningful travel that's happening, like just high value stays rather than high value short stays rather than extended stays that are happening now. How can you want to think about how can you lean into weekends or think about your event or holiday driven demand and prices. And especially one thing weird, and we'd get into this quickly with data, we're starting to see shorter booking windows. How do you react to those shorter booking windows and not panic is also something that we should consider, and we'd look at some of that data.
I would add, this is something we see over and over. Traveler is changing their behavior, their expectation, and even just the way they find you in the first place. Obviously, there's the big OTAs, the Airbnbs, the booking.coms, and so on. But search is effectively changing how people are finding their vacation rental properties. And I wrote an article actually just last week on a trip to Turkey that I did this summer, a little vacation, and realized that even my own behavior being in the industry completely changed. How I was searching for the right property, the activities, and how I was actually narrowing down where I wanted to be before I could actually go on the OTAs and start searching the actual properties. And in some cases, you can actually use the agent mode to go ahead and book completely for you. That isn't as popular just yet, and there's still a few caveats there and some trust issues, but we are seeing that traveler behavior completely change. The first piece, and you touched up on it perfectly, which is that shrinking window. And this affects not just the anxiety that you or your owners might get when it comes to certain seasons, but also the process that you might be running with guests. Last minute reservations tend to be a bit more riskier reservations. So you might have additional verification processes for those guests. But also just in general, it creates a bit more anxiety for you as the property manager as to whether or not you'll hit some of these numbers. That being said, we are seeing a lot of moves from different OTAs that are also driving some of these shrinking windows with more flexible cancellation policies that are giving a bit more freedom to guests to make decisions last minute or to even cancel last minute to switch up their bookings. Pull and push forces between what OTAs are doing to help with cancellations and so on, what we're seeing on the market. I'll just point out to the rise of AI search once more, which is, we saw a year and a half, 2 years ago, a bunch of new AI trip planning apps that were popping left and center. And I distinctively remember going on a webinar and saying I didn't think that there would be a big future for these trip planner apps. And the reality is there is a future for trip planning on AI, but not on a dedicated app. People are just using it in the same sort of ChatGPT interface and searching for those destinations differently. And that is effectively changing a lot the search behavior for your direct booking websites. People might be finding you more often than you might think, or might not be finding you at all. One great example is a property manager out of Colombia in Medellin called Casacol, who has so many different articles about tourist locations, about blogs, local gyms, outdoors, and he is being cited over and over with the AI as a top destination over Airbnb, booking.com, and other OTAs, which is positively impacting his brand visibility as well as just overall direct bookings. So something to note is that your behavior is changing, your guest behavior is changing, and there's something you should probably look at when it comes to adapting to that. Do you want to talk a bit more about that rise of AI search, maybe some of the market variations?
Yeah, for sure. On rise of AI search, I have definitely used search for trip planning, AI search for trip planning. I'm yet to use it for searching accommodation, but I've definitely, like for my restaurant reservations or figuring out where to go, etc. I've definitely used AI search to come up with those. It's changing so fast. But coming to quickly market, like shrinking windows, and we'll look at a graph shortly in this, right? But generally, we're seeing booking lead times, particularly for this year, have been shorter nationally. I say nationally across US. They've been shorter in the first half of the year compared to previous years, indicating that people are booking last minute. However, market variations exist. In Chicago, we've seen stretched out booking windows, 46-day booking windows for July, versus in Miami, it's just extremely short, except for July, where for some reason people booked far ahead in advance. Having said all of that, ADRs are still rising and people are booking for higher priced properties. Our takeaway from that is they're still willing to pay for the quality or more disposable income. Key takeaway for you, especially as we move to the next 4 months, some bit of shoulder season, slower season, and then into the holiday season for Christmas and New Year's. It might be that in your markets, travelers are booking closer in, and they might be, like Francois said, relying on AI for travel search. Your demand is becoming concentrated, and so you should really try to figure out what are your key dates, key periods that are going to get booked? And the answer may lie in your historical data where you figure out what were the days that you generated most revenue for, and then use that to come back and say, am I rightly priced in 2025 for the same days? Or do I want to do this any differently? Do I want to take same amount of risk or do I want to take lesser risk? Here you're seeing the median booking window. The gray bar here is the median booking window for each month in 2023, 2024. And then the blue bar is for the same time in 24, 25. In 2024, July, people were booking 31 days in advance versus in July 2025, they booked 28 days. That does not seem like a very big number. 3 days shift, what's the big deal? But when you start to look at it at scale and we're looking at it here from a national averages standpoint, that's a very big swing for an average across 1.6 million listings in a month to get. People are booking a lot later or a lot more last minute relative to what they've done in prior years. What that translates to is, say, previously you may have gotten a booking 4 months in advance for New Year's. Now, that does not mean that you'd get 4 months minus 3 days. Because the averages are shrinking, that might mean you might get 3 months in advance or 2 months in advance, and not just, even though this graph represents the median, the actual fringes may be shrinking a lot more.
This is where we go back to these guest changing behaviors. So the last minute reservation, there's so many factors that can play here. I think you touched up on a few earlier, saying whether it's the economy, whether it's people's mindset of, should I be waiting until last minute to book my place? I'm not sure if I'm going to book a hotel, a vacation rental. There's so many factors that can lead to these last minute discovery or last minute bookings. What we are seeing though, 82% of people find AI search way more helpful than the traditional search for their property. So AI first discovery is changing how people are thinking about their holiday and where they're thinking about booking. They expect a completely frictionless booking experience, which is something most OTAs deliver, but something that you might not necessarily be delivering just yet when it comes to your direct booking websites. I still see a bunch of blank pages when you click on book now on certain people's websites. So if you are going to have that experience, make sure it's tailored for the expectations of most guests. Reviews are becoming so much more important. If you know this data point on Airbnb, if you are less than a 4.5, you are in the bottom 5% of your markets. Having high reviews is key. And we're seeing a lot of these changes as well with how people are searching guest favorites, guest favorite gold. The superhost status is becoming less and less valuable. And really the guest favorite, the reviews, the trust from the community is becoming more important. That's all about local authority content and trying to see the host as the curator of the experience. As you're searching with AI for a local property manager or an experience, if your reviews indicate some of these experiences that the host was able to curate, this is actually going to play a huge role in your discoverability versus if it just says your check-in was okay and the property was clean. So things to factor is that personalization. And then last but not least, there's one hub mindset, which is shifting from having all these different sources of communicating with guests. They want the easiest traveling experience. They almost want you to predict when they are going to check in so that they have that hotel quality stay. With rising ADRs, people expect a hotel stay since they're paying almost the same rates as hotels in certain areas. So that is changing how guests see your vacation rental business. And to many that I've spoken with in the past who say, but guests don't understand that cleaning a 4-bedroom house is completely different than cleaning a 300 square foot hotel room. Yes, they don't see that. They don't understand that, but they still expect the same services and quality experience they would get in a hotel. And so to adjust that, start thinking about being answer worthy, being able to accelerate some of those trusts and those highly personalized reviews that go beyond just the basics of did the check-in was smooth and the cleaning was done. And then delete any sort of friction throughout your guest journey and your guest experience process. So if you're asking for too many things before they even get to the property, if you're asking for all of this information because of HOA compliance, or even if you have to, for example, collect IDs and send them to local authorities in Spain, all of these different steps can add friction to the journey. And with expectations that this process be seamless, and with now much more flexible cancellation policies, people might opt out and decide to go with a different property or their second choice. Now, let's talk a bit more about what leading operators are actually doing. And I'd love to understand here from your perspective the alignment of the minimum stays with those guest behaviors, because we've talked a lot about these different searches, discoverability. We've talked about these shortening booking windows. How does that align between the guest behavior and those minimum stays?
What we're starting to see is there are still a bunch of folks who have not necessarily aligned their minimum stays with how the market's changing. There are probably longer stays that are happening in the market. People are traveling for more shorter vacations, maybe economic choices that they're making, etc. And you want to be really making the choice for your market. You could once again look at your own historical data or market data to make these choices. Just to explain this point, we have the graph for Chicago versus Miami here for the last year. And what you'd see is a lot more of the stays are in Chicago are short 1 to 4 days, versus in Miami, people are going for longer stays, 7 days, 14-day stays relative to Chicago. And then you see a lot more 29 plus day stays in Chicago, maybe just traveling folks who are staying there for remote work or traveling nurses or whatever else that's happening. But that 7 to 14 day stays are a lot more prevalent in Miami than in Chicago. And the 3 to 4 day stays or 2 day stays are a lot more prevalent in Chicago versus Miami. You can use this to understand what segment do you want to play in. Is there even enough of minimum stay demand in your market? Now, if we jump to 2025, like the 4 months of 2025, leverage the pacing data. If you're using PriceLabs, this exists in your pacing charts and portfolio analytics to understand the forward-looking occupancy and spot and capture if there are any demand that exists due to holiday spikes. If you're using PriceLabs at an individual listing level, you can find this data in your neighborhood data. Or if you are looking at a portfolio level, you can pull in some market comp sets in your portfolio analytics spacing data to get this information. Try to figure out, are you trying to go for occupancy and are you trying to be competitive with lead time? Some folks might want to be, right? In which case you may want to say, for example, in PriceLabs, maybe you may not want to have far out premiums, which we have turned on by default, a far out premium. You may want to say, hey, I don't want to have far out premiums for the rest of 2025. And then maybe when I go back into 2026, I turn them on. Or maybe I want to extend that window to outside of 6 months is when I want to have a premium. So you may want to adjust on that. We also have an adjustment called occupancy-based adjustments. And you may want to play with that as well and say how much you want to discount based on what kind of occupancies are you seeing. And then lastly, I would say length of stay. Are you being too restrictive compared to the market patterns? Look at the market patterns. We also rolled out dynamic minimum stays, which give you an understanding of what's happening in the market. You can either let PriceLabs run your length of stay restrictions by specifying the lowest that you'd go, and then let PriceLabs control it, or at least get insights from it to determine what you're going to do with your length of stay. And then from Enso,
we're focused primarily on the guest experience. Once the booking is confirmed, once PriceLabs has actioned the revenue there, we're looking at primarily sort of the add-on side, the fees and different protection tools that you can leverage for those last minute reservations, but also as revenue drivers. If you are a property manager, the incremental revenue that you can generate on a guest is quite significant from a profitability perspective, because it's revenue that you get to keep at 100% for that revenue. The other piece is leveraging AI internally and with guests. This is something we're working actively on, and we'll share a bit of a special offer on this, but profitability comes in two ways, whether growing revenue or reducing costs. And so thinking about how you're going to scale those vacation rental units and the staffing that you might necessarily need for 50, 100, 150 listings will change over time as some of these AI tools get more and more developed. Things to consider here. We are going to dive into a bit more of these top incremental revenue drivers for 2025 and some of the data we've seen so far year to date, because quite frankly, the conversion rates are really interesting for those who are actively upselling their guests. So I'll drive through a few specifically around operational and experiential upsells, as I call them. The first one is this concept of operational upsells, which is early check-ins, late checkouts, mid-stay cleanings, gap nights. This is a very high converting upsell opportunity. It's easy to implement. It increases guest loyalty and satisfaction, and also just overall your brand awareness. You can do this as simply by sending a Stripe payment link to your guests or going through the Airbnb Resolution Center, or of course, doing it through a more formal guest web app experience. Now, what's been interesting from the data that we've seen with our clients over the past couple of months, since January, since we started tracking, and keep in mind, we launched this product about a year and a half, almost 2 years ago, and we're now generating north of 1.5, almost $2 million every month for these customers on these different types of upsells and fees. What's interesting is obviously the early check-ins and late checkouts pace out throughout the year, aligned with some of the numbers that we saw with last-minute reservations from PriceLabs. Early check-ins convert a lot better than late checkouts in general at 38% when presented with different options. So that includes the free option of a 30-minute, 1-hour early check-in, all the way to pricing it and saying you can check in at noon. Late checkouts convert a bit less. Our hunch is that guests think they can just check out without even late checkout without actually requesting it and just leave a bit later if they need to. That might be the reason for a lower conversion rate there. Overall, we're seeing a steady growth in the average transaction values, people changing their rates on those upsell opportunities, probably tied as well to the number of bookings they have before and after each reservations, and therefore the operational complexity of delivering that. A quick tip for people who are thinking about offering this, I always get the same questions on this, but one big thing here is if you are offering your check-in instructions over 2 days before and giving all of the instructions because you want to avoid that pesky question of how am I going to check in, you are going to completely drop your conversion rate on early check-in because they have all of the instructions. So whether you do guidebooks, messages, instructions, however you want to structure it, give them enough information to arrive at the property, but restrict how they're going to get inside the property to really just when the check-in time is available. We recommend anywhere between 30 minutes to even 10 minutes before making access codes or instructions more clear and available, but don't provide it 8 hours, 12 hours before. So just a little quick bit here if you're not seeing the right conversion rates. In terms of upsell transaction values versus the nightly rate, early check-ins range anywhere from 15% to 40% of the average nightly rate for that stay. Late checkouts more in the 10 to 35%. And then gap nights, people are discounting them or providing them at full price of whatever is listed on the OTA. So again, a wide range of operators. I've seen very low metrics on the early check-ins, like I've seen insanely high numbers. One example I always love to give is a property manager in Aspen who sells his early check-ins for $450 because his argument is you get an extra half day on the ski slopes. Pretty interesting niche there. Obviously not for everyone, more in the luxury market, but a good variety. And again, revenue that you get to keep at 100% of. The next bit I'd like to point out, and this is something we'll give a few examples of property managers that have been extremely successful on this, is the experiential upsells. These are a bit harder to implement. They do increase that guest loyalty and satisfaction and your brand awareness. But more importantly, you are the guide. You are the person that guests trust and ask questions to. As much as that might be frustrating having to answer those guest questions, they are asking you because you're the local authority on that. And this is shared, I forgot to add the source here. As much as people say it's not important to meet you as the host and don't really want to meet you, they do trust you enormously when it comes to their destination. Many of them are actually doing research on you as the property manager or the local host before they're even renting. So yet another opportunity to market to your guests what additional experiences you're able to offer beyond just the accommodation and the stay. And if you still don't believe me on the value of some of these upsells, think about Airbnb. Airbnb is already capitalizing on it with one of their recent updates around Airbnb experiences. I know some may have been a bit underwhelmed by it in terms of volume of experiences, but we are seeing that number grow steady on the Airbnb experiences. And this is, again, the reason most people travel and what Airbnb is trying to drive there. I'll finish off on one last point, which is the fee-driven component, and then we'll summarize with a few examples. And that is damage waivers versus safety deposits. This is a concept of arbitraging on safety deposits and effectively allowing you to drive incremental revenue to protect your asset. I'll run through a very quick example of how this works. Effectively, it's saying give the guest the option to choose between a safety deposit or a one-time damage waiver protection fee. The guest gets to choose. In one case, assuming 100% conversion, you would be collecting over $31,250 worth of safety deposits. This is assuming 25 properties portfolio. In the other case, you're keeping a $6,250 monthly waiver revenue that you get to keep 100% of. So one is a deposit. It's almost a liability. You have to pay it back. And the other one is actually a revenue that you get to keep. And what this means is on one side, the damage waivers, guests don't like additional fees, especially when they're mandatory. But when you present them as optional and give the guests the choice to choose between the two, they actually end up picking the mandatory fee. There's no disputing or chargeback or any sort of item there because you've collected the payment. It's outstanding. So on one side, 100% conversion would include $75,000 worth of additional revenue on these 25 properties versus zero on the safety deposit. And if you estimate 25 cases of damages on those properties at $500 each annually, which is your safety deposit amount, you're still in the green. So you're still net profit of 62 versus the safety deposit. Just different tactics that we've seen property managers leverage to present their property to guests to get those bookings and then to find alternative ways to compensate revenue with upsells, fees, and additional revenue drivers there. The damage waiver conversion rates is steadfast. We're seeing a different window for this one simply because it's the moment the guest books and not before the guest checks in. So it's usually done at the booking confirmation stage once they've confirmed the reservation. But the numbers are staying steady. And again, we're comparing those who present a forced damage waiver with those who present an optional one. So the conversion rates are particularly higher. Just a use case in ideal scenarios with different cases from operational to experiential upsells to these damage waivers and different types of fees, you could be netting net of $5,000 on 25 properties per month in additional revenue that you get to keep 100% of. So imagine $5,000 extra profit on 25 properties and what impact that might have on your vacation rental business. These are different assumptions based on early check-ins, late checkouts, fees, which you might drive through your PMS, through additional software, and so on. Benefits, guest satisfaction boost, a revenue increase, a competitive edge to present these different types of offers. And as we discussed with Richie on the fact that simply guests are looking for reviews with these additional components. Oh, I was able to check in early. I was able to have these different experiences will help you be more visible on different search components. If you don't believe me, just believe different people who are using Enso, but also in general, different people who are upselling. We saw DG Home with these damage waivers and flexible access see a 8% revenue boost. We saw Goodnight Premium Stay. They've driven over $900,000 in the past 12 months. 418 came in the first 6 months. And even Flow Home, which is really focused on that experiential component and driving over $10,000 a month in additional revenue with just 10 listings. And that's because they curate a whole experience around it and have become market leaders in their experiential stays. So just a quick tidbit there on how to think about additional revenue streams. And of course, if you want to learn more about these, I am always sharing on LinkedIn, self-promoting my LinkedIn profile here, always sharing different stories of unique property managers and what they're doing on these additional revenue streams.
Francois is one of the finest people to follow on LinkedIn. Do take his advice. And if you're on LinkedIn and active, do follow him. And you'd hear good success stories of what other property managers and operators are doing.
I appreciate it. Let's talk about where we should focus next. What are your ideas for property managers in the later half of 2025 and trickling into 2026?
As we are getting past the high season here, I really want to double down and say we're getting into the shoulder season, we're getting into the holiday season. Make sure that you've looked at your prices, especially for your weekends, holidays, local events, again, the key holiday season, Christmas, etc. Or maybe your market has Halloween travel, etc. But do look at those key travel dates and make sure that you're rightly priced. How are you trending against that? Those can be your drivers, key drivers of revenue. If we continue to see people book last minute, don't get too anxious and about dropping prices too quickly. See how the market's reacting. Of course, if you're using PriceLabs, will react to how market is shaping up. If people are changing their behavior, that makes sense to be a little bit more flexible. You may not want to drop your prices too early, or you may want to say, hey, I want to capture my demand really early. I want to be safer for the second half of this year. I'm okay with capturing bookings at slightly lower price, but with a certainty. And so that's a choice that you could make: lower price, certainty of booking, versus continue to take some risk because we know short-term demand is coming in late. You want to be adaptable with your revenue strategies. You want to know how you're setting up your stay restrictions. Do you want to change those stay restrictions? Do you want to offer certain kind of discounts like Francois was talking about? As you go into the next 4 months of this year, right, you want to plan a little bit and say, do I want to be more certainty of revenue and less about absolutely maximizing my revenue? Or do I want to take the risk because I know demand will come in my market? I want to keep my prices till the time if I feel like it's not, and then start dropping.
I would add tomorrow's competitive moat isn't necessarily going to be more listings. I know obviously the scaling property manager wants to be a 100-unit property manager, wants to be a 500-unit property manager. And it makes sense because more properties means more revenue, but it also means a lot more hassle. So understanding how you're going to scale your business and not just grow it from a number of properties, which means how you structure your team, how that's going to scale, especially in this wave of AI, how you're going to internalize that within your organization, and then unlock these moments of guest delight to drive a lot more personalized reviews. When I look at different properties online, a lot of the reviews are great check-in, clean property. It was great. That doesn't give me enough insights as a guest. And so what I'm relying on are the badges that Airbnb is providing, like guest favorite and so on. And so now you're competing on the OTAs to have these unique, I want to call them almost like NFTs, but maybe they're not, just unique random filters and categories that they're creating to differentiate your properties when realistically people are trusting other guests and the reviews and what they've provided. So try to drive those delight moments, get people to share that in your reviews, and that will make your searchability a lot more exciting. Tomorrow's competitive moat isn't necessarily more listings. It's going to be more of those moments of guest delight unlocked by some of the data that you're able to drive.
How do you charge for damage waiver on Airbnb? Through the resolution center?
Yeah, so it's a good question. Some people bake it into their price already. And so that's something that just makes it, I think I saw a comment actually from someone who just shared that they were doing this, Natasha Sander, who was mentioning that she bakes it into their management fee. But the other option is what I was mentioning, which is to provide optionality to guests. So if you force it as a fee based on the new policies, that's not going to fly with Airbnb. They want payments on platform. But if you provide it as an option where you allow the guest to choose between a safety deposit and a damage waiver, that's where it's totally fine to provide that option. And one of the advantages is at Enso, we're officially partnered with Airbnb. So we have a direct integration, which allows us very soon to post that safety deposit amount to your reservation, making sure that we abide by some of those new policies around full price on the reservation. So different ways of doing it, include it in your reservation costs or display it as an option for Airbnb guests specifically. For other OTAs, it's still fine. And you can provide it as off-platform fees for the most part.
Ray's asking that Airbnb doesn't want security deposit. Is that something? I'm not familiar with this.
Depends on the property. Yeah, it's a good point. Some properties will not be allowed to have safety deposits. So it's an exception basis. They're actually going to decide which properties are allowed, which properties are not, depending on if you have insurance that requires you to have a safety deposit, if you're part of an HOA or a building that requires you to do this, or sort of legal restrictions. So you have to get effectively a approval from Airbnb in order to get safety deposits. That being said, for any of my European friends, I know a bunch of our French clients would just have a complete riot if they couldn't have safety deposits. So it'll also depend on markets and who is allowed, who is not allowed. So make sure to ask your Airbnb rep effectively if you fit by those rules.
There is one question that maybe you can help with rule of thumb. How much should someone charge for an early check-in for, say, more than 1 hour?
Yeah, anything in the sort of 1 to 2 hours, we'll see a 35 to 60 US dollars, depending on which option and seasonality. Usually people like to provide 3 to 4 different options. And what's worked best for me is popcorn pricing, which is this idea that, so if you ever go to the movie theaters, the small is $5, the medium is $6, and the large is 10. And everyone gravitates to the medium because they're like, it's just an extra $1 and I get more popcorn.
Sure. Yeah.
So it's the same option. You're going to provide a 3 p.m. check-in, 2 p.m. check-in, or an 11 a.m. check-in. And then the 11 a.m. check-in is basically a whole new night. And so people will request that middle tier. There's different ways of playing around with it. Quite frankly, I wish we had a direct connection to PriceLabs, where PriceLabs did the dynamic pricing of these upsells, because I think there'd be so much, even more revenue to unlock. But maybe a conversation for later, Richie.
For sure. There's a question from Kelly about the articles and blogs that contribute to increased stay on someone's website.
Yeah, we've provided a bunch of case studies online on some of these property managers. So if you go to our resource section, you'll see different examples with the links to their websites, how they've accomplished this. And of course, always happy to put property managers in touch with other property managers to discuss some of these strategies, because it's easy to talk as a vendor about what we've seen across the market. I think it's always even easier when you get to speak to a property manager in your market or in a similar market and compare notes on some of these strategies. Kelly, feel free to reach out directly. I'd be more than happy to put you in touch with any of these specific property managers that have driven this. I see one question for you, Richie, which was around the sort of upcoming pricing changes on October 7th, and specifically to Airbnb, the mandatory changes on October 27th. Do you have any comments on that you might want to add?
Yeah, absolutely. If you're a host in US, there is a change that's coming in starting October 7th, 27th from Airbnb, where you'd no longer have split fee, but one single fee that goes out of host's payment. This is not new. This is something that Airbnb did in most of European markets and APAC markets in 2021. And they've been slowly rolling it out across all markets. They've decided that October 27th is the cutover date where they'd move this. We'll follow up with some emails on how you want to make that adjustment. But essentially, for simplicity, whatever the increased percentage is, that's how much you want to increase your base price by, so that you're effectively your net money that you get does not change. And we'll follow up with how do you make that calculation over email. But that's what you're trying to do here. Nothing changes really other than how the whole mechanics work. And I'm not even sure what the logic behind is. I have some hypothesis, but rather not conspiracy theorist on this call. But what you really need to do is just a guest. Let's say they were getting charged $120 because they had some Airbnb fee that they were paying, the service fee plus whatever your host fee, 3%, 4% was. And now they'd still pay that $120, but all of that fee comes from you. So you want to increase how much you were charging, right? So you basically want to charge 120 now rather than maybe previously charging 105 or whatever. Yeah.
Do you help the properties appear higher on Airbnb and Verbo? I love this one.
Robert, I'm not sure what we have heard. And these softwares, Airbnb, VRBO, Booking.com, they continue to play with their search algorithms, what shows up higher, what does not show up higher. One that we have heard is that if you're an active property manager, active host, you do show up higher. And so if you're changing prices frequently, and hopefully you're also getting booked as a result of it, then and with Enso, hopefully you're managing the guest experience. So you leave with 5-star reviews, you should show up higher on the search. That's the idea. And other than that, there's no way for us to confirm that do you show up higher with PriceLabs or not. Having said that, because we do optimize prices, with optimized prices, hopefully you're getting more bookings. And with those bookings, hopefully you do show up higher.
I feel like the more frequently you update your pricing, though, and it's the same with description and other items, it does help rank significantly on some of these OTAs versus a stale listing that stayed the same over a course. But it is a black box, ultimately, how they rank things.
Thank you so much, Francois, for joining. Really appreciated your insights. Really appreciated hearing about Enso Connect. And Francois said, please do follow him on LinkedIn. Fantastic resource to follow. And then I understand, Francois, you have a special offer here for our listeners.
We do. We are launching very soon a full agentic model that is basically reasoning, that shows you the thinking of the chatbot. So think of a simple chatbot that helps answer your guest questions, but with a content that is dynamic. So as you answer questions, if there's wrong information, we can update it live for you. This is getting released very soon. It's already live in beta for certain users, and we're making it free for anyone who signs up in 2025 for the rest of the year. So I put a special offer here. It will be available on our website. Richie, I really appreciate you having me on this webinar today.